Well, greetings, Virginia Woolf fans. This is a special edition of Rhetorical Figures of Repetition that I'm doing in conjunction with reading Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway. Part of the reason I'm doing this is because this novel represents, among its interesting features, one is a sort of return to the classical idea of the Aristotelian unities of time, place, and action. So, you know, if you read Aristotle, he talks about the fact that that most dramas of the time took place over a 24-hour period in one locale, and they basically had one plot with one or at most two sort of subplots. So the idea was you're limiting the action. This idea, so Aristotle is being descriptive here, not necessarily prescriptive, although the French in the mid 18th century decided to make it more prescriptive, so that if you wanted to write dramas at that time frame, then you were bound then by the unities. So as you know, Mrs. Dalloway takes place within a 24-hour window, one place, London, and you've got the main plot that centers on Clarissa Dalloway, and then you've got a handful of subplots, but they're small, and the most important of which is the subplot of Septimus Smith. With no further ado, what I'm going to cover here is a number of the rhetorical figures of repetition that Woolf makes use of. And so once you learn these things, and if you go back and look at the novel with these things in mind, you will just see how often and to what tremendous effect Virginia Woolf uses these devices in particular. And she uses other rhetorical figures, but repetition is, I think, and I've not found anywhere in her letters or in any of the sort of biographical information about her writing of the novel, that she intended to do this, but it is so obvious that I feel compelled to present this, because the plot involves lots of flashbacks and things of that nature that help to enhance the sort of stream of consciousness quality that this narrative style takes. So let's go ahead then and let's see if I can share screen here, and I'm going to go to my presentation. Go. All right, here we go. So we're talking about figures of repetition then in this novel, and the three that we're going to cover will be alliteration, anaphora, and epistrophe. Okay, so from your study of poetry, you're probably aware of how some of these things work, and I want to say that that they're super subtle. If you look at the novel from sort of start to finish, these sorts of elements are they're all over the place. And I'm going to show you some places where it's clear that Woolf was seeking to use this as an aesthetic element, and also as a unifying element. So what we're talking about here is alliteration being the repetition of initial consonants or consonant clusters, and these are in stressed syllables close enough to each other for the ear to be affected. And so what we've talked before about the fact that human beings like patterns. We like to create order out of whatever is perceived chaos, and so alliteration in this case is serving that purpose. Okay, so in terms of what it's doing there and what are its effects, so in rhetorical terms, it's used for the sake of melody. Okay, so there's a musical quality to it. It also then creates a sense of anticipation, particularly where you've got alliterative elements that occur more than twice. So once we hear it the second time, then our ear is pushing forward in anticipation of the next occurrence of this. Okay, so it also creates an auditory image, and I'm going to give you an example of that. I think in earlier presentations like this, I've talked about in William Shakespeare's Sonnet 12, when I do count the clock that tells the time. So those K's and T's in that regular iambic meter mirror the sound of a ticking clock. Okay, so the skilled writer, and Virginia Woolf is indubitably that, will match the sounds, euphonious, these are smooth sounding, pleasant sounding, or cacophonous, discordant, rough sounding, to the situation at hand. Okay, so here's a sample from page 69. And this is in my version of Mrs. Dalloway. So there you have it. So up in the sky, swallows swooping, swerving, flinging themselves in and out. Okay, so you could argue that the S in the sky would constitute part of that alliterative string, but because the SW sounds are so unusual and so closely placed that I've highlighted them there for the sake of this illustration. So what you've got then is that the repetition of that of the sibilant SW sounds, that consonant cluster, evokes the auditory image of the birds in swift, see what I did there? Dynamic flight, okay? What a dork. All right, so here's another sample, and this is a longer passage, and these are the kinds of things that if you're tuning your ear to it, then you will just see how often Woolf does this. So here you go from page 20. A breeze flaunting ever so warmly down the mall, through the thin trees, past the bronze heroes, lifted some flag flying in the British breast of Mr. Bowley, and he raised his hat as the car turned into the mall and held it high as the car approached, and let the poor mothers of Pimlico press close to him and stood very upright. So this, I only focused on the alliteration here. So these, again, the initial sounds, but as you can see, things like trees and bronze and heroes, those Z sounds then contribute to the overall, rather synesthetic quality of that particular passage. Okay. All right. So now the second element we're going to look at is anaphora. So anaphora then is the repetition of the same word or words. We think about word clusters at the beginning of successive phrases, clauses, or sentences. If we were to extend this to poetry, then it would be in successive lines, poetic lines then. Okay. So the purpose then and effects, so it creates a rhythm in a text, whether that's pleasing, rousing, or relentless. Again, the writer is going to employ this in service of some overarching element relative to the place in the text they're concerned with. So anaphora is also used to express a strong feeling, and Woolf uses this extensively in this novel. But I'll just remind you that particularly if you listen to the to speeches, Dr. Martin Luther King comes to mind, Winston Churchill comes to mind, John F. Kennedy comes to mind. Their use of anaphora as not only a unifying feature, but also as one that is used, say, to build toward a climax. Okay, so again, expressing strong feeling. So it links two or more ideas through the repeated phrasing. So that's in a situation where the grammatical structures are not identical. If they were identical, as we'll see in an example in a moment, then that comes under the category of something called isocolon, which is then parallel structures grammatically that again unify ideas. So it also then makes a phrase more memorable for the reader or listener. Okay, again, human beings looking for the patterns, the order out of the relative chaos. So here's a nice example from early on, page 4. And so Clarissa is thinking of Peter Walsh here. It was his sayings, one remembered, his eyes, his pocket knife, his smile, his grumpiness. So if you can see that the unifying element by emphasizing and repeating the pronoun his, this centers the attention directly on Peter Walsh. And if you think about the way she's ordered this, his sayings, okay, so we have the auditory then, his eyes, so we have the visual, okay, his pocket knife, and this pocket knife, of course, is going to be emblematic of Peter Walsh's say, a lack of confidence in his masculinity. I mean, what would Freud say about him whipping out that pocket knife at every opportunity, especially when he's feeling somewhat emotionally threatened? His smile, his grumpiness. So ending with the grumpiness is like the acknowledgement that he is not, all of her memories of him are not particularly positive. Okay, so this is Septimus Smith here on page 22. But he would not go mad. He would shut his eyes. He would see no more. In this case, because we are in the mind of Septimus Smith at this point in the novel, again, early on, it gives us an indication that the interiority of his thoughts and the fact that he is fighting hard for self-command. Okay, but he is of course falling apart. But he's British. He was in the military. He's been taught to stiff upper lip and all that kind of thing, and yet he finds himself unable really to keep it together. So then epistrophe. So you can think of epistrophe as the opposite in a certain kind of way of anaphora. So now we've got repetition of the same word or words at the end of successive phrases, clauses, or sentences. Okay, so this is used for melody, for emphasis, and for progression of thought. So the effects are not unlike those attributed to anaphora. However, the main distinction that I'll give is because the units of speech occur at the ends of grammatical structures, then you have this sense of anticipation is enhanced. This also ties into to something called the recency effect, meaning that the thing that you heard most recently has a greater impact on you than its opposite, say the primacy effect. So here, when you hear the structure that occurs or the repetition that occurs at the end of little grammatical structures, once we hear it twice, then we're expecting it to show up again, and your mind is actually quickly racing forward, waiting for the opportunity for it to occur again as this sort of unifying element. Okay, so here's a sample from page 15. The chauffeur who had been opening something, turning something, shutting something, got onto the box. Another one here is, this is Peter Walsh running up to see Clarissa. Yes, 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 he muttered as he ran upstairs. She will see me after 5 years in India. Clarissa will see me. Again, this is the interiority of Peter Walsh's mind, and the idea that even though they have been apart for a long time, Peter is pushing past basically Lucy, who might have said, well, my lady is upstairs, my mistress is upstairs, attending to something. You can't really just like barge in and head up, but he is sort of relying on their past relationship to sort of overcome the servant and make and make his will manifest. The beginning of that passage with the yes, 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 it's an example of epizeuxis, a repetitive form for vehemence, and I'm going to talk about that in the next video. So, all right, so next up here in our scamper through the figures of repetition in Mrs. Dalloway, we've got something called diacope. Woolf uses this extensively. Once you see, as you're going to see in the next video, once you see what this is and are able to identify it, you'll just see how often it occurs throughout the course of the novel, as do the following: epizeuxis and then epimony. Okay, so stay tuned to the next video for a continuation of figures of repetition in Mrs. Dalloway.